You cannot speak to the government. It doesn't matter what was said. It doesn't matter who agreed to it. All you're doing is passing the buck. None of that matters. You do not sit down with the government. You know what you say when the government comes calling? That's what you say to the government in these people's world. I'm the professional. Don't tell me anything. I'm the professional. You're watching me. What's up, everybody, and welcome in to another edition of the Sit Down. As always, if you enjoy this video, please make sure you hit that like button. Let me know what you think of today's discussion in the comment section below. If you're new around here, you just haven't done it yet. We're living on a rocket seeing this video for the first time. I don't know what you're waiting for. Hit that subscribe button below now so you never miss another sit down video. Today, ladies and gentlemen, we're going to get in to another mafia topic. And over the last couple of weeks here on YouTube, there's been a lot of speculation about the brother of John Gotti, Gene Gotti. On this channel, I've mentioned for years that I believe he is still a very active member of the mafia today. I also believe that it's possible he's a very high up in the family. I want to make today's show clear. It is speculation, but there's a lot of things that we know about these people that I'm going to put out there. A lot of stuff that we know in covering this subject. The truth of the matter is we may never know Gene Gotti's status. But at the end of the day, if he lived by his brother's thought of the mafia, do we really think he came home and just said, you know what, I'm done? We're going to get into all that and more. The story of Gene Gotti next on the sit down. Gene Gotti was born on October 31st, 1946 in the Bronx, New York. Now, in the late 40s, the Gotti family would move to Brooklyn. In fact, according to the 1950 U.S. Census, the Gotti family would live on East 13th Street in Brooklyn. Now, one thing that I have noticed is that over the years, no one has really looked into the Gotti family tree, if you will, and I find it all very interesting. Now, the father and patriarch of the Gotti family, John Gotti, right? This is the father of Gene and Peter and all these guys. He was born way back in 1907 and was from the Bronx. Now, John's father was a person called Carmine. He and his wife, Rose, who is John Gotti's grandmother, were both from Italy, and they had a big family in their own right. Now, Gene Gotti's mother, Philomena Fanny DiCarlo, was born in 1913. Now, the one thing we know about John Gotti's father is, for the most part, it was said that he was unemployed, may have worked construction at one point. According to the census, in 1940, he was listed as a chauffeur, living with his young family at 942 East 215th Street in the Bronx. Now, by the time the Gottis moved to Brooklyn in nearly 1950, that 1950 census would state that John Gotti's father and Gene Gotti's father was listed as unemployed. And on that 1950 census, he and his wife, Fanny DiCarlo Gotti, had 10 children. Now, one thing that we've done on this channel is we've seemingly talked ad nauseum about John Gotti, and we feel like we know everything about him. Now, again, I know that the Gotti family had children into the 50s, but as of 1950, they had 10 children. Now, Fanny Gotti's children included. What I find interesting about all this is the oldest in 1950 was 16 years old. It was listed as a person called Carmine Gotti. Now, this would be the oldest son. Now, I also noticed that in the 1940 census, Carmine Gotti is listed as 6 years old. Now, I've never heard the name Carmine Gotti. The only Carmine Gotti that we know of is Carmine Agnello, right? Or Carmine Agnello's son, Carmine Gotti. I'm really questioned with this because from what I always had understood, there were 5 brothers: John, Peter, Gene, Vincent, Richard, or 6, I'm sorry, and then Bill Gotti, who's not in the life. 5 in the life, 1 not, and that was Bill Gotti. From what the census tells us, there was a oldest son called Carmine. Now, Fanny Gotti and John Gotti's other children included Rose Gotti, Lucy Gotti, Peter Gotti, John Gotti Jr., which was John Gotti Sr., as we know him, Richard Gotti, Marie Gotti, Gene Gotti, William Bill Gotti, and Patricia Gotti. So again, a lot of kids, and they would eventually have more, including Vincent in the early 50s. Now, what we know about Gene Gotti is this. Him and his brother would spend their days running the streets of Brooklyn around what we would now call it Ocean Hill, Brownsville, that area, East New York. And they would run around with a school hood chum called Angelo Ruggiero. And they would eventually become part of something called the Fulton Rockaway Boys. Now, in a show that I did about the other Gottis, 4 of the Gottis would follow their brother John into the life. Obviously, Peter up on the left, Gene on the right, Richard and Vinny on the left, and then the other brother, Bill, was not involved with the life, and he moved to L.A., and he still lives in that area. Now, Gene Gotti's first major arrest would come in 1967. He would be arrested alongside his brother John and Angelo Ruggiero in what the FBI would call essentially in control of a valuable cargo of stolen furs and wedding dresses. And they were charged with theft as far as interstate shipments. So basically, they were hijacking loads near Kennedy Airport, and they got caught up. They would eventually be hit with federal charges. And Gene Gotti, who at the time lived at 1240 Herkimer Street in New York or in Brooklyn, would get 3 years in prison. By that point, he was obviously very involved with the mob, and he would eventually not only be a hijacker, would be involved in loan sharking and selling narcotics, most notably H. Now, one thing we also would know about Gene is he had a major loan shark book, and that was run with people like Joey Scopo and eventually Ralphie Scopo. Now, the one thing that is always seemingly lost in fans of mob history is they don't realize that Gene Gotti was actually made nearly a year before his brother. Gene Gotti would be made into the Gambino crime family in late 1976, possibly early 1977. He was 30 years old. That is nearly a year before his brother John would be made in late 1977. Now, there's one thing that I always had garnered from John Gotti and Gene Gotti's relationship. They were thick as thieves. They were always with each other throughout their early lives. We see them in various photos. They were always spotted at social clubs, at funerals, at different wedding events, and things they were doing. They were always together. And that's one thing that's really important when we think about who Gene Gotti is, who he is, the man that he is, the man that he came up being. One thing we know about John Gotti is he would say that if he would steal a steeple from a church and it was sticking out of his backside, he would deny it. That's the kind of guy he was. He didn't take pleas. He never bowed to anybody. If Gene Gotti was anything like his brother, which we could venture to believe he was, I don't really need to talk much more about is he still active in the life. It's probably common knowledge. That said, let's get in a little bit more to his story. I know a lot of people know a lot of this stuff about Gene. I'm just kind of trying to set the chronological life that he's had. As we know, in 1983, John Gotti Sr., Gene Gotti, and other members of the Gambino crime family and associates are hemmed up in a federal racketeering beef. Not only were John and Gene arrested, but also arrested was Johnny Carniglia, Angelo Ruggiero, Gambino associate Mark Ryder, as well as Gotti lawyer and Gambino lawyer Michael Coiro. Now, a lot of the information that the feds would glean came from telephones in the home of Angelo Ruggiero. At this home, which is now obviously renovated at 370 Barnard Avenue in Cedarhurst, Long Island. And we would learn all sorts of things about the telephone calls from Angelo Ruggiero's phone. We would learn everything from the fact that Ruggiero discusses purchases of up to 27 kilos of H, and that was gotten for approximately $150,000 from a connect in Florida. They would then sell it wholesale in New York for $200,000. So essentially clearing about $50K a key. Understand, if they sold 27 keys and clearing 57 at each key, or sorry, 50 at each key, that's $1.3 million in 1983 or early 80s. So that's good money. Now, also picked up on these conversations is Gene Gotti. At one point, he would be talking to Gambino lawyer Michael Coiro. In the wiretap, Gotti is said to be heard warning Coiro, quote, "Nobody is to know but us. They are holding whatever. You're not our lawyer. You're one of us, as far as we're concerned." To which Coiro is said to have responded, quote, "I know it, Gene, and I feel that way." So essentially, Mike Coiro is not a lawyer. He's part of what they're doing. And everything that happens, he's one of them. So again, all very incriminating. Eventually, there's a long 6-year odyssey with this trial because eventually some things start popping up. That said, in 1987, Gene Gotti is acquitted alongside his brother for loan sharking, gambling, murder, and some of the other stuff involved. That said, he does still have to face the drug stuff. And that would lead to, as we know, in 85, all the stuff with Castellano, because Ruggiero doesn't want to give up the tapes because they're talking about Paul on the tapes. We've all heard that before. I do want to, though, talk about some of the mistrial stuff, because in January of 1988, there's alleged jury tampering going on. And from what I understand, in October of 1987, the United States Attorney General learned that the Federal Bureau of Investigation had received information from confidential sources that the defendants, including Gene Gotti and John Carniglia, as well as Angelo Ruggiero and Eddie Leno, had identified members of the anonymous jury for the purpose of influencing the verdict. Specifically, they employed a private investigator called William Sewell to trace the license plate of suspected jurors. Now, after Sewell had a falling out with the defendants, they used a different investigator, a man called Victor Giuliano. Now, this confidential information indicated was that defendants had learned the identities of at least 5 of the jurors, and that one of them, a black juror, had been approached and was, quote, now compromised. Now, investigators had learned that juror number 4, who's one of the few jurors who parked near the courthouse, owned a car with a, quote, vanity license plate consisting of his first initial and full last name. After finding out his address was in Queens, the FBI investigators determined that he lived approximately 5 doors away from 2 men whom they suspected of engaging in organized crime activities, often connecting and associating with the defendants. Now, this goes back to Gene Gotti due to the fact that this information prompted a grand jury investigation into jury tampering. Now, while investigating, a person called Gary Barnes, juror number 2, was excused from the jury because it was discovered that he was not a U.S. citizen. 2 days later, Barnes told FBI Special Agent John Flanagan that a coworker, Mel Rosenberg, had telephoned him that morning and arranged to meet him. According to Barnes, Rosenberg indicated he believed Barnes was a juror in the case and was a friend of defendant Gene Gotti, and was offered Barnes a new BMW in exchange for information about how the, quote, jury was feeling. Now, on December 22nd, 1988, at approximately 7:20 a.m., Agent Flanagan questioned Rosenberg at his home, and he admitted to calling Barnes, but said that it was, quote, a joke. He denied that he ever met someone with the initials GG or the name Gene Gotti. He told the FBI agent that the only attorneys he knew were his brother-in-law and his own attorney, Brian Levinson. At the end of this interview, Agent Flanagan served Rosenberg with a subpoena to appear before the grand jury. So again, a lot of this stuff it was possible that Gene Gotti was trying to influence the jury and that several black jurors were, in fact, one offered possibly a BMW. So a mistrial was given. Gene Gotti and the boys then get yet another trial, which is thrown out as well. And down the road in May of 1989, guilty. 6 years after the original charges, Gene Gotti and John Carneglia are given guilty verdicts. Now, remember, Gene Gotti was offered a plea, but in unison with his brother, who didn't take pleas, he declined to take the plea as well and was given 50 years. Remember, Gene Gotti fought to the end in a bitter battle, just like his brother. That's the kind of guy he was. Now, I want to discuss Gene Gotti's behavior in prison because for long parts of his sentence, we didn't hear much from him. We would see photos pop up like this one, but we didn't hear much. You got to hear some of these wiretaps of phone calls involving Gene Gotti in approximately the late 90s and early 2000s. Throw in the fact that it is common knowledge that on the regular, his brother Peter would visit him to ferry messages, to make decisions. Ask yourself this: why is Peter Gotti going to Gene Gotti to get approval on things? Just ask yourself that. Also, from a law enforcement source, around the 90s, it was indeed possible that Gene Gotti was already on the administration of this family. Let me tell you something, and this is my opinion, no one else's. This is my opinion. I truly believe, I cannot prove this, but I truly believe since 1985 until today in 2025, the Gotti family has been in control of this family the whole time, whether just through a ultimate front boss, street boss, whatever. That's just my opinion. Now, I also want to throw more things out there. And I've never discussed this because, again, this is just speculation. I know a lot about this world. We all do. And I know who these people are. That said, listen to these conversations between Gene Gotti and his crew member, Fat Salvatore Scala, who, remember, was indicted in the 2000s and was given charges on throwing his mob tax to Gene Gotti while in prison. Now, in prison, according to a transcript on November 18th, 1999, Gene Gotti can be heard complaining to Salvatore Scala that he hadn't received a share from a certain money-making scheme since, quote, my brother Johnny went away. Ask my brother Pete, when did I get anything? Scala then responds, quote, in referring to $1,000 a month, Gene responds, who? Who's getting that? That's what I want to know. My wife ain't getting it. Scala responds, you get it every week. Gene, I never got it. Who's taking it now? Scala, your brother gets it. Your brother has it. Gene Gotti, he's taking the money? Scala, he's not taking that. He gets it. Gene, what's he, holding it? Give it to my wife. She'll hold it. Now, Gene Gotti ends the conversation with, quote, wise guys get cheated out of their fair share of the spoils when they're behind bars, essentially. Scala responds, that's what I've been trying to tell you for the past couple of years. I thought he was in jail and not active. Some of you folks that are on here, I think you just need to look in the mirror a little bit. I find it amazing that some of you folks believe that, like, and here's another thing I want to talk before I get to the other conversation that's quite incriminating on if he's still active. Do you think when Gene Gotti over the last 20 years, do you think he just had a change of heart? I don't want to do that anymore. I don't want to do that behind bars anymore. I'm not a gangster. How many times do I got to tell you folks, and we heard it in the intro, there's two things you don't ever do as a mobster, especially someone like Gene Gotti. You don't talk to the feds. And number two, there is no retiring. The only end to this life is in a pine box 6 feet under. That's it. That's it. And it doesn't just stop because you go to jail. And another thing that I've heard, Gene Gotti is not on lifetime parole. Okay, I want to make that clear. Gene Gotti didn't get a life sentence. He can't be on lifetime parole. And let's just say he is. Do you really think he cares? Do you think all these people aren't surveilled on a regular basis? And here's what Gene Gotti would do if he's still in the life. He would just not hang out with felons. A lot of guys do it. You just don't go to weddings and, funerals. As long as you don't violate, and let's just say he does. Do you really think he cares? Do you really think it's going to prevent him from doing something he's been around for 50 plus years? Let's get into some other conversations. Nearly 2 months after the 1999 conversation into the 2000s he had with Cicale, Mr. Gotti was in a phone call with a person called Frank Russo. Now, Frank Russo is an entrepreneur and restaurateur who owns a catering hall in Howard Beach called Russo's on the Bay. Now, during this talk in 2000, he tells Gene Gotti, quote, "Things are likely going to be straightened out very well." At a restaurant to which Russo recently put up $40,000. And Russo then says, quote, he'd likely get a return of about $20,000 a month. Gene would then tell Russo, quote, "As soon as you see Peter, just tell him, here's 8 for you. Here's 4 for Jeannie." Now remember, this is important. Frank Russo has never been arrested on anything criminal. That said, in the testimony of Mikey Scars DiLeonardo, which you can go and find, DiLeonardo would testify that Russo, quote, would kick back $1 a head to the Gambino crime family for every dinner at weddings at his club, Russo's on the Bay. So again, Gambino crime family have their hooks into this guy. And Gotti says on tape in 2000, give 4 to Peter, give 4 to this guy, give 4 to Jeannie. Again, do people just think he has the come to Jesus moment over the last 16, 17 years he's sitting in prison? Doesn't work like that. Gene Gotti would ultimately be released from prison in 2018. Now, obviously, he can't hang out with known felons. Wouldn't be very difficult to get a young up-and-comer, a young associate that's clean to pass messages. Understand that when you look at someone like Gene Gotti, the power that he has, due to the fact of how long he was in prison, is more important than anything. Anything. And I've heard a lot of talk about the Sicilians that run the family now. There's no Sicilians that run the family, other than a certain L guy, who, by the way, if you read into the Gotti tapes, this is common knowledge, worshipped John Gotti. You don't think he worships Gene Gotti? And we heard John Gotti say, we're going to be proud of these guys someday. The Lorenzos, right? The Richie Martinos. John Gambino's gone. Dominic Cefalu, I know a lot of people want to paint him as this mythical being that is stronger than everybody. Let me tell you, he don't hold a candle to Gene Gotti. And remember how many people, as far as big people in this family, are still around and came up alongside Gene. Di Maria, Carrazzo. Who else? Monk Sassano, Tommy Sneakers. All these guys, Paradiso, all these guys, still all around. It's comical when I hear some of these things on here. Now, remember, too, how many shows have we done where we've talked about this? If someone can name one person that's an old timer in their 70s, 80s, or 90s, is there any of them that just go become Walmart greeters or mechanics? What about Sonny Franzese, shaking down strip clubs in his 90s? I'm not telling you Gene Gotti's out doing that. I'm not at all. I'm telling you, he doesn't just quit that life. It doesn't work like that. I have no way to back it up. I believe he is a high-ranking member of the family. I think he was gifted that. And in fact, I don't even know that he was gifted. I think it was just assumed. Because you look at what he was, he's fucking royalty in this family. Fucking royalty. And I know a lot of people are going to bring up his family. Let me tell you something. John Jr. hasn't talked to his uncle in a long time. I guarantee it. The family that he has, he don't talk to them. I'm going to tell you right now. He ain't going to, family events. That ain't happening. And also, remember this. The front boss system, I've said on record before, we know the Genovese are doing it. The guy you think's running it ain't running it. I've talked to various sources, and they all have told me the thing that I know already. What you think you know about this Gambino family ain't true. It ain't true. So, can I prove it? Like a lot of the stuff in this world, it's hard to. But just look at what we know about Gene Gotti. That's all I ask you to do. And we're really just having fun with this. Not that we should have fun doing this, but we're speculating. But if you know anything about Gene Gotti, he's Cosa Nostra to the core. Gene Gotti is 78 years old. He lives on Long Island in a home that he's lived in for a long period of time. In the comment section below, I want you to tell me this. What do you think Gene Gotti's up to today? And by the way, please do me a favor. Don't bring up the supervised release to me because none of these guys care about that. Okay. And again, as long as he's not hanging out with known felons, it doesn't matter what he does. He can go wherever he wants. He's not on house arrest. So as long as he stays in his house and an associate brings him his cash, he don't care what happens. Let me tell you this. They'll get to him if they need to. The people that need to get to him in that world, they'll get to him if they need to. Because the FBI has no bearing on if a young kid comes to see Gene. There's nothing illegal about that, especially if he's got a good name. So that's that. I hope you enjoyed this video. Let me know what you think of it in the comment section below.